Well, thanks for tuning in today. We're going to do a winter scene. This is a pretty dynamic scene with lots of light, and I wanted to spend a little time before I get started on the painting talking about the drawing. And if you notice, this drawing is pretty bold, pretty dark lines around these high contrast areas. Because I know that I'm going to be layering so much, I made sure that I made the drawing dark enough so that I wouldn't lose it. Because you don't want to lose it. You're on your own once you lose that drawing. And so some of the more subtle areas, you notice that the pencil lines are lighter, you know, where the shadows are on the snow and stuff. The paper is a 300-pound hot press arches, and so it's definitely it works better with a more transparent approach. And so my washes are certainly more diluted. And this is more layered, perhaps, than maybe some of my other paintings. This is the palette. This is my standard palette, and we're going to use a lot of these colors, not all of them, but quite a bit. And as I was, thinking about this commentary, I instead of calling out my mixes as I'm doing them, I still put the labels on, like I've done in some of my other videos, so you can see some of the mixes. They're a lot of it's mixing right on the paper too. And so here we have, quinacridone red and pyrrole scarlet and the two blues, cobalt and ultramarine. And it's not, sometimes it's just pure, just one color. Sometimes it's a mixture of a couple, and sometimes the mixture really happens on the paper. You can see with this wet into wet, the surface with this paper, the surface opens up, and you end up with a kind of a velvety surface. It's a really nice nice surface to paint on. It's a beautiful sheet of paper. But it does, it does mean that you have to paint a little different than if you're used to just a cold press surface, because it is smooth. I've pre-wet all of the entire painting, and I'm covering up just about everything. I mean, I'm leaving a few lights, and I'm going to put in, I'm going to use masking fluid. And instead of putting the masking fluid on now, or before I started putting in color, I went ahead and I'm putting in this wet into wet so that it knocks those values down a little bit, because it's sometimes when you use masking fluid and you finally take the mask off, what you find is these really harsh white shapes. And in this painting, there's a lot of shadow, and the light is, some of the light is kind of strong, and the strongest light I tried to leave, some of just the white paper. Before I did that, I made sure that I dried the paper really, really well, so that there wouldn't be any lifting of the surface when I remove the masking fluid. And you'll notice too that as I'm putting in these colors, sometimes I will wet a surface, re-wet it, and then go in and dab and pick up. And so I didn't leave a lot of real pure lights, pure whites, but I don't think that it really affected the painting. I still think that the light effect is pretty strong. And so you can really, I tried to zoom in on some of the major mixes. I didn't indicate all of them, because some of them are so subtle, and sometimes it's just a swipe of a color into a premix that's already on the palette. Sometimes it's just a swipe of a color and directly into the painting. And so we would have labels everywhere if I tried to do that. And so I tried to zoom in and just sort of, highlight the main mixes. And once, we get through so far the painting, these mixes are repeated over and over again. And sometimes, puddles of color migrate into each other and create a new mix. And it's almost impossible for me to, indicate all that, especially on a video like this where it's compressed. You'll notice as I'm painting that my clothing changes 3 times. This painting was done in 3 distinct sessions on 3 different days. Probably, trying to guess what the timing was for those. The sessions may have been 3-4 hours at a time. What's interesting though is when I was putting the video together, the pure just brush on the paper totaled about 4.5 hours, but that certainly is not indicative of how long it takes to do a painting like this, because what you don't see in these compressed videos is all the time spent looking at the painting, letting an area dry before I go back in and hit it. Some parts of the painting are still a little bit damp, and it's almost impossible for me to indicate all that on a compressed video. I think the best way for you to know whether the paper's dry or wet is what happens when the brush touches the paper. If it bleeds out, then the paper obviously is still damp. If it's a harder edge, then obviously the paper has dried. So these early washes, I'm constantly variegating this paint, and this is so important in landscape painting because very rarely do we have single colors on anything. There's so much light, especially on a day like this, a real sunny day with light bouncing off of everything. So it's kind of rare that you would find just one single color in there. So lots of times they migrate into a warm will migrate into a cool. The green might tinge a little blue, and so these are called variegated washes. And so the key is, on the palette, make sure you have lots of paint to pull from, lots of variety to pull from if you want to achieve that in your paintings. Having the masking fluid on, and I don't use masking fluid that often, but this seemed like it made sense in this kind of painting. Having it on there and allows me some freedom, and you can see here that it allows me to sort of freely paint into an area, knowing that some of those lights are preserved and some of the lights aren't. The drawing is detailed but not real detailed, and I didn't go in and try to decipher all of that information on those trees. And so what I was trying to do is just find a summary amount of light hitting the pine boughs, knowing that I would do reverse painting around other ones, and that some of them would be knocked down because of that previous wet into wet. And so it's pretty early on. It's trying to get this information in, but still be broad enough that I don't get bogged down in the details. And that's why you can really, you see those washes are still pretty juicy. I'm really loading the brush, putting it in, letting the paint move, letting it sort of interact with the paint. There is a little bit of a tilt to my board, and so that helps control. I have a couple rolls of masking tape under my board, and so that helps control the paint a little bit, gives it a little bit of some place to go. But these early areas, on this paper, it does tend to dry down and lighter, definitely. I mean, most watercolor papers do. This one seems to do it a little more. And so with that in mind, I know I'm going to be layering, and especially because I'm so transparent, and there's so much water in these washes. And anytime you have very watery washes, you're going to lose value. And I know that, and so I kind of settle in knowing that this painting is going to take a while. It's going to be a lot of layers. And some areas are perhaps easier to understand. Others are a little bit harder. The boughs up in the trees, the snow, these are all hemlocks along the stream. I felt pretty good about this, putting in just various values on there, looking at the photo but not really following it that closely, just sort of trying to suggest shadows underneath some of these boughs, and just just putting in layers and looking at it and spending time just trying to figure out what it is exactly I'm going to try to get out of this. There are some really deep darks in here, and so you can see and I've indicated some of those mixes, and they do dry down, they fade, and so I have to go back and hit them multiple times. Could I have eliminated some of those layers? And I probably could if I'd gotten a little heavier with my paint load, meaning a little less water and a little more paint. But I kind of like on this on a hot press surface, like I said, I'd rather keep the paint a little more transparent and layer these darks. They seem to still maintain their vitality. They don't get heavy or muddy. And that's what I'm afraid of on a hot press surface. When you get too heavy with the paint, it can sometimes bog down the painting and get a little bit, a little muddy, a little dense. Some of the warms that I'm using are repeated. The colors are repeated multiple times, and that is the quinacridone gold and quinacridone burnt orange are used a lot here. I don't believe I used any of my yellows at that. The only yellow that I used was quin gold, which is it's a great mixing color. All the quinacridones are great mixing, but when quin gold mixes with the different blues, you get some beautiful, beautiful greens, and that green that it gave me seemed to fit, and it also gave me some harmony with the water and the stream bank. And so that quin gold is in the quin burnt orange, which is like, we're kind of looking at it as a brighter burnt sienna, and the quin gold is sort of a brighter yellow ochre, meaning it's just has more color intensity. And so these trees, a lot of the, you put down, I'll put down a layer of quin gold, and then come back in with a blue, come back in with a mixture of some blue and some permanent brown. For the really dark darks, I will reach for raw umber and mix it with indanthrene blue, which gives me pretty much a black. And but just sort of picking those spots, because that's not a real attractive color. It's not a really pretty dark. It's just a really dense dark black, and I need this in these. This is such a value painting, and I need those really deep contrast. And so when you see those blues start to drift into like a really deep steely gray, that's probably because the indanthrene blue has been used, which is a really strong, warm color. It's sort of on the, it's like indigo, but it has a little more blue to it, and it's on the ultramarine side, so it has some warmth, and can make some really great dark values. At this stage, you can really see where I masked off. You can see those limbs and some of the pine boughs. I used a really fine rigger to do all the masking, and took my time and just tried to get a nice rhythm to those marks, knowing that I would be using some white gouache with this painting to go in and supplement some of those masked lines or masked areas. So here you see me mixing up some of those really dark values, but I'm still pretty watery there, meaning I've got a lot of water in the mix, and so it's knowing that I know that I'm gonna lose some value as it dries. But again, I'm willing to layer that in, and you see how much paint is there. It goes away very quickly, and so I'm always advising my students, make sure you have a lot of paint in the paint wells, and make sure that it's fresh and that you mix up big puddles, because boy, it goes away quickly, especially, this is a full sheet watercolor, so the areas are larger. You see this brush that I'm using, I've used repeatedly, especially for the mixing, and that's it's a synthetic squirrel hair by Princeton called a Neptune. Not necessarily that I would use it directly onto the painting all the time, because it does deliver a lot of paint. So in this instance, I've used it to do my mixing because it does carry a lot of paint, and then switched over to a 3/4 inch flat. The water's kind of interesting for me. I thought in the photo the reflections were kind of busy and I mean nice, but kind of busy and distracting from what I was trying to achieve in the painting. And so I didn't do much drawing, if hardly any, in the water, knowing that I would just get in there and start laying in color and floating colors into one another and just sort of see where it goes. And that's kind of a gamble. Sometimes that, where it goes is good, and sometimes where it goes is bad. And this is okay. I think I'm okay with what it ended up with. It wasn't, since I didn't have a real defined sense of how I was going to try to render that surface, since I wasn't really using the photo as my, as a true reference. I was just sort of suggesting it. I just you just got to wing it. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm putting in some of these shadows. And notice lots of times whenever there's a related shape, so in this case, I'm painting the water, but at the same time, I'm also painting the shadows underneath the trees. That's because they're related in value. They run together. And so that way it keeps the painting connected, harmonious, and you get a more complete image, and you don't have all those sort of, white shapes floating around another shape. And so it's a lot of that. If there's a connection by value or a connection by color, even if they're completely disparate objects, maybe it's a car and the street, say we're doing a city scene, then you paint both at the same time. You let the two colors run together. That gives you more of a complete, connected, harmonious image. So there is a lot of detail in this painting. If you look, in the photo, and so it's really up to me to decide how much information do you want to disseminate into your painting. And again, I didn't draw very much in this foreground area. And so you see I'm using a small number 6 brush and just sort of picking some spots, putting them in, spending some time, looking at it, trying to figure out, do I want to add more? Do I want more information? And that's really the balancing act of watercolor, and representational watercolor, is trying to find that happy medium between specific information and too much information that basically bogs down the painting. And again, that kind of goes back to the aesthetic of what it is that you're trying to achieve. I like painterly passages in my painting, but in this instance, I want some specific information, and so trying to find that balance between the two is just a juggling act. And to be honest, I have a feeling for what it is that I'm trying to do here, but the beauty of watercolor is that it's so immediate, and we're never quite sure. We have a plan, and the plan may change as the painting goes on, and you might decide to do something, and it's the wrong thing to do at the wrong time. And so watercolor is so immediate. You've got to be in the moment. You've got to be thinking all the time, thinking ahead that, okay, I'm going to make this wash here. What's it going to look like, when it dries down? Am I going to bring something back into it? So at this point, I've removed the masking fluid, again, dried the painting thoroughly, went in and removed it. And I was a little apprehensive because this paper's, after it's been wet like that, the surface gets a little bit soft and open. I was afraid it might damage the paper when I removed it. And that's the beauty of using that drawing gum. It's Pebeo drawing gum. It really is very thin, and it doesn't put a real heavy amount of masking fluid. It's very easy to remove. And so at this point, I'm going in and I'm covering actually many of these masked areas, not necessarily completely, but putting in some shading and trying to find that balance, again, between light and form. And you'll notice that, you know, sometimes it's a real subtle color that I'm putting in, and sometimes it's a really strong value, and I'm just going back and forth and just trying to get a feel for it as the painting develops. You need those darks, you need the mediums, and at this stage, you know, I'm feeling pretty good about where we're going with it. Again, the water is still a mystery to me as to how much information am I going to put in there, and so it's continuing this same process of, you know, adding, spending some time looking. That's what you don't get in the video. You don't get all the moments where I'm just sitting there staring and trying to make a decision as to maybe what color to use, what brush to use, you know, how big should this shape be, and it's just a process. It looks very direct. It looks like, wow, you know, look at the decision making, how quickly those decisions are made. And it's not. It's just a feel, and, you know, deciding that, you know, I need more color here, more value here. So here I'm using opaque gouache. It's Winsor Newton permanent white, and these are mixtures with cobalt blue, and sometimes they're watery. If they're real watery, they just get absorbed, and it's a very subtle mark. If it's thicker, it'll go on and it won't dry down darker. And so trying to, you know, integrate those masked areas into the painting so they're not so harsh. And that's the challenge. So here the gouache, I'm also putting in some light. I'm mixing it with some Quin Gold and putting in some of where the light is hitting the hemlock boughs. This process went on and on and on. You really don't get a sense of that. The process of where I'm going to put some of these opaque touches, and I usually have a little bit of that in almost every painting. I like it. I like to have contrast of opaque and transparent in my paintings. I'm a big John Singer Sargent fan. If you look at Sargent's paintings, that was certainly something that he did. Also study Anders Zorn, beautiful use of gouache in his paintings. So, but how much, you know, there is a line that you have to draw. Too much, and your painting becomes heavy, and it, you know, and if one of the things that you probably don't want to do is fix your painting with gouache. It'll look like you fixed the painting. You know, it just shows through. What you're doing is you're accenting, you're supplementing some of the, you know, really beautiful transparent washes. And so now we're back to putting in these shadows, and this is just cobalt blue. I don't think there's really any color additions to this other than just pure cobalt. So I'm working back down around those light areas, and, you know, when you do that, it leaves a hard edge, and so sometimes I'll you know, slide the brush on its side, try to get more of a broken edge, you know, just so that it doesn't leave such harshness where that light is dappled on the snow. I liked how the cobalt looked as it crossed the stream bank there in the foreground. It just gave a real subtle little shadow. Here I'm going back in, again, still working on trying to figure out what I'm going to do with these reflections. And so I decided kind of reluctantly to go in and use some diluted opaque white. That wasn't really on my horizon. I didn't see that coming, but it really needed to, it had to have some relationship to those reflections, or those snow-covered trees up there. And this is these are much stronger in the photo. And again, like I said, I wanted to keep it a lot more subtle than what was in the photo. And it seems like it's a happy medium between that. Here I'm going back and just putting in just really light touches with the gouache and a little bit of the Quin Gold. That's a cobalt blue and white gouache mixture. It's diluted, so it'll dry down. You actually see that. It's kind of neat how it, as the timing of the painting where I cut out sections and move to the next section, you see it just almost disappear, but it's just a really nice, subtle value change in there. And there you see it there. It just sort of goes, it gets absorbed. So again, like I said, this process of adding the gouache was really time consuming, and some of those marks, some of the marks I'd put in would just get absorbed by the, because they were so watery. And I was willing to sort of just keep layering that in. As long as I didn't get too heavy, I was, willing to just keep doing that. This is one of the more fun parts of the painting is, we're getting to the end game and putting in those really crisp darks that really pop out. And that was fun. I enjoyed doing that and just picking the spots. If you, go back in the video and look at the reference photo, you'll see there's a lot of dark little spots, where the stream bank was sort of opened up and the little rocks and mud and stuff like that. And again, I didn't draw hardly any of it, and so it's just a matter of putting it in with the brush, looking at it. You put down a wash, put down a shape, study it, say, okay, I'm going to put some more down, and just hope that you find that right mixture of contrast that you need, and shapes and activity. Occasionally you'll see me flick the brush. It's just a cheap way to get some really small little marks in without having to actually paint them in. I did that early on too. I didn't mention that in the wet into wet too. Just flicked in some cad orange, and it's just another way to deliver paint. Allows the paint to mix right on the surface when you're doing a wet into wet like that. Again, this is more cobalt blue. That's such a dominant color in this painting. It's used in so many of the mixes, and oftentimes just by itself. And here it goes in with some manganese, probably to put a little bit of that blue cast back into the water from all the blue that's being reflected back down. So we've finished the painting, and these are some details that show you some of the brushwork, some of the close-ups. So I appreciate you tuning in and watching, and please share this video and subscribe to see future videos. And thanks for watching.